May 17, 1940. Northern France, 12 miles from the Belgian border. A farmer stood in his potato field, watching the horizon burn. Heinrich Vanderkamp pressed his calloused hands against the wooden fence post, feeling the vibrations before he heard them. The ground trembled, not from artillery, not from bombers, but from something worse. Panzer tanks, advancing in columns so long they looked like a steel river flowing across the French countryside. The local garrison commander had just called him insane. "You want to do what with your fields?" the captain had shouted. "Are you mad? We need anti-tank guns, concrete barriers, minefields, not whatever this agricultural nonsense is you're proposing." But Heinrich Vanderkamp had no military training, no engineering degree. He'd never designed a fortification in his life. He was just a potato farmer who understood something about soil that the generals didn't. And what he was about to build would stop more German tanks in 2 weeks than the Maginot Line stopped in 2 years. This is the story they don't teach in history class. The story of how one farmer's knowledge of drainage ditches and root systems created the most effective anti-tank trap of the early war. Stay until the end, because what happened next shocked everyone, including the German High Command. The problem facing the Allied forces in May 1940 wasn't just that the Germans had more tanks. It wasn't just that the panzers were faster, better coordinated, or supported by dive bombers. It was that the flat agricultural lands of northern France and Belgium were perfect tank country. Miles and miles of open fields with firm, dry soil that could support a 40-ton tank moving at 25 miles per hour. The hedgerows that would later plague Allied forces in Normandy didn't exist here. No natural barriers, no rivers wide enough to matter. Just endless farmland with gentle slopes and good drainage. The kind of land that farmers had spent generations perfecting for cultivation. The kind of land that was now a highway for Wehrmacht armor. Traditional anti-tank defenses weren't working. The concrete dragon's teeth could be bypassed or blown apart with concentrated fire. The tank ditches took weeks to dig, and the Germans simply drove around them, spreading out across the vast agricultural plains. Minefields worked, but there weren't enough mines, and the Germans had learned to send infantry ahead with mine detectors, clearing paths for the armor to follow. The death toll was staggering. In the first week of the German offensive, Allied forces lost over 400 tanks. Not because of superior German gunnery, not because of mechanical failures, but because the defenders couldn't slow down the German advance long enough to establish proper defensive positions. The panzers just kept coming, rolling across those perfect fields, and there was nowhere to make a stand. Every town became a brief battle that ended in retreat. Every crossroad was defended and then abandoned. The refugees clogged the roads, making military movement nearly impossible. The medics were overwhelmed. The morgue details worked overtime. And through it all, the tanks kept coming. Allied commanders threw everything they had at the problem. They positioned anti-tank guns at every crossroad, only to watch the Germans bypass them through the fields. They tried to crater the roads with artillery, but the panzers simply drove around the craters. They attempted to create choke points at river crossings, but the Germans found fords or brought up pontoon bridges faster than the defenders could react. The French had built the Maginot Line precisely to prevent this kind of mobile warfare, but the Germans hadn't attacked the Maginot Line. They'd gone around it, through Belgium and into northern France, where the terrain favored speed and mobility over static defense. Every field was a potential avenue of advance. Every farm was a possible assembly area. Every village was bypassed or overrun within hours. The tactical nightmare was simple. You cannot defend everywhere, and the Germans could attack anywhere. The mathematical reality was crushing. The Allied forces had to defend a front hundreds of miles long. The Germans could concentrate their armor at any point, achieve local superiority, break through, and then exploit deep into the rear areas before reserves could respond. The problem seemed unsolvable. Except one person refused to accept that. Heinrich Vanderkamp was not an engineer. He had no college education. Before the war, before the world went mad, he'd been exactly what he looked like. A potato farmer in northern France, third generation, working the same land his grandfather had cleared from forest 60 years earlier. He was 53 years old, with a weathered face and hands that bore the permanent stains of soil. He'd fought in the Great War, but as an infantryman, not an officer. He'd seen combat, yes, but he'd come home and gone back to farming, because that's what men like him did. They worked the land. They understood seasons and soil and water tables and drainage. And on May 17th, 1940, as he stood watching the distant smoke of burning villages, he saw something that the generals didn't see. He watched a column of Panzer IIIs advance across his neighbor's wheat field. The tanks moved quickly, confidently, their treads barely leaving marks in the firm soil. The field had been prepared for spring planting. The land rolled and compacted, perfect for supporting heavy vehicles. The farmer and Heinrich noticed details. The way the tanks avoided the softer ground near the irrigation ditches. The way they naturally channeled themselves along the slightly higher, drier ground between fields. Something clicked in his mind. A connection between two pieces of knowledge that had never needed connecting before. Tanks avoided soft ground. Tanks needed firm soil to operate effectively. And Heinrich Vanderkamp had spent 35 years making soil firm for planting and soft for drainage. He understood soil composition the way a watchmaker understands gears. He knew how water moved through earth, how saturation affected bearing capacity, how quickly different soil types could transition from solid to mud. The problem wasn't that the fields were too open. The problem was that the fields were too perfect, too well maintained, too carefully drained. Generations of farmers had worked to create firm, productive agricultural land. They'd dug drainage ditches, installed tile drains underground, graded fields to prevent standing water. They'd made the land perfect for farming, and accidentally, perfect for tanks. What if you reversed it? What if you deliberately destroyed the drainage, flooded the fields, turned firm ground into a quagmire? Not obviously, not with visible barriers that could be bypassed, but subtly, using the existing agricultural infrastructure in ways the Germans would never expect. The challenge was enormous. You couldn't just flood a field and expect it to stop a tank. Water drains, soil dries, and the Germans would see obvious flooding and simply avoid it. The solution had to be hidden, persistent, and tactically positioned to channel enemy armor into kill zones where anti-tank guns could engage them from concealed positions. Heinrich spent that night in his farmhouse, sketching diagrams by lamplight. His wife brought him coffee and asked no questions. She'd been married to him long enough to recognize when he was working through a problem. His hands trembled slightly as he drew, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was proposing. If he was wrong, he'd look like a fool. If he was right, he might save lives. The concept was deceptively simple. Potato farms in northern France used extensive underground drainage systems. Clay tiles buried 3 feet deep, running in parallel lines 20 feet apart, all draining into collector ditches that carried excess water away from the fields. These systems were invisible from the surface. They'd been installed decades ago and required only occasional maintenance. If you blocked these drains strategically, sealed the collector ditches, and then punctured the topsoil in specific patterns, you could create subsurface water traps. The fields would look normal from the surface, firm and solid, covered with crops or freshly tilled earth, but underneath, the soil would be saturated, the bearing capacity destroyed. A man could walk across it, a truck might make it part way, but a 40-ton Panzer would break through the thin crust and sink, its treads churning uselessly in the mud below. The genius was in the placement. You didn't flood the entire field. You created killing corridors. You left obvious firm paths that would channel the tanks exactly where you wanted them, into carefully prepared zones where the ground would fail under their weight. And you positioned these zones in terrain where the disabled tanks would block other tanks from bypassing them, creating traffic jams under the guns of waiting anti-tank positions. The next morning, Heinrich walked 6 miles to the local garrison headquarters. The Belgian captain who commanded the position was exhausted, having been awake for 48 hours straight coordinating the defense of a sector that couldn't be defended. He listened to Heinrich's proposal with growing skepticism. You want to flood your own fields? Destroy your own drainage systems? Not flood, Heinrich corrected. Saturate. Underneath. The surface will look normal. And you think this will stop tanks? I know soil mechanics, Captain. I know what happens when you put 40 tons of pressure on ground that can't support it. The captain rubbed his face. He'd received a dozen crazy proposals in the last 2 days. Farmers wanting to string barbed wire across fields. Mayors suggesting they evacuate entire towns. One old man had insisted they poison the wells to deny the Germans water. Everyone had an idea. Most were useless. But something about Heinrich's quiet confidence was different, and desperate times called for desperate measures. You have 48 hours, the captain said. If the Germans reach this sector before then, your experiment ends. If it works, I'll authorize you to replicate it across every farm in the area. If it doesn't, he didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what failure meant. Heinrich gathered 12 men, other farmers, too old or too young for military service but strong enough to dig. He explained what needed to be done, and they looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Destroy perfectly good drainage systems? Deliberately ruin productive farmland? In the middle of planting season? But they also heard the artillery getting closer every day. They saw the smoke on the horizon. They understood that perfect farmland wouldn't matter if the Germans won, so they picked up their shovels and went to work. The work was brutal. They had to excavate the collector ditches at specific points and install wooden dams reinforced with clay. They had to locate the underground tile drains using memory and old maps, then dig down 3 feet to block them with concrete plugs. They had to puncture the topsoil in precise patterns, creating hidden channels that would allow water to migrate into the prepared zones, but prevent it from draining away. Heinrich worked alongside them, his hands bleeding, his back screaming. He was 53 years old and hadn't done this kind of heavy labor in years, but he drove himself and he drove the others because he knew time was running out. The sound of artillery grew louder. Refugees streamed past on the road. German reconnaissance aircraft appeared overhead, circling like vultures. On the 3rd day, they finished the first field. Heinrich stood at the edge and studied it. To the casual eye, it looked perfectly normal. Slightly uneven ground, common in agricultural land. Some darker patches where the soil was richer. Nothing that would suggest anything unusual to a tank commander studying it through binoculars. But Heinrich could read it like a book. He knew where the water was pooling underground. He knew where the bearing strength had been compromised. He knew exactly where a tank would break through and exactly where it would sink. The test came on May 20th, 3 days after he'd first conceived the idea. A German reconnaissance unit, 2 Panzer IIs scouting ahead of the main force, approached from the northeast. They followed the road initially, then turned onto the farm track, exactly as Heinrich had predicted. The track looked firm, well-traveled, obvious route to use. The first tank made it 50 feet onto Heinrich's modified field. Then the ground gave way. It didn't collapse dramatically. It wasn't like a sinkhole opening up. It was worse. The tank simply settled. The treads sank 6 inches, then a foot, then 18 inches. The driver gunned the engine, trying to power through, but the treads just spun, digging deeper, churning the hidden saturated soil into thick mud that oozed up around the hull. The second tank tried to bypass, moving to firmer-looking ground. It made it another 30 feet before it too settled and stuck. Within 5 minutes, both tanks were immobilized, their crews bailing out and retreating on foot as Belgian anti-tank guns, pre-positioned exactly where Heinrich had suggested, opened fire on them. The garrison commander arrived an hour later, staring at the 2 disabled tanks in disbelief. "It worked," he said, almost to himself. Then, louder, "It actually worked." "The ground will stay unstable for weeks," Heinrich explained. "As long as it keeps raining, as long as the drains stay blocked. And even if they figure out what we did, they'll have to avoid every field that might be modified. They'll have to stick to roads, which we can defend." The captain grabbed Heinrich by both shoulders. "How quickly can you replicate this?" "Give me 50 men in 5 days. I can modify every farm within 10 miles. You have 30 men and 3 days. Make it work." Word spread rapidly through the local command structure. Within 24 hours, Heinrich was demonstrating his technique to engineers from the French First Army. Within 48 hours, farmers from 6 villages were implementing variations of his design. Within 72 hours, the Germans encountered modified fields across a 12-mile front. The impact was immediate and catastrophic for the German advance. Panzer columns that had been moving at 20 miles per hour suddenly slowed to a crawl. Routes that looked clear from aerial reconnaissance turned into mud traps. Tank commanders, trained to avoid obvious obstacles, found themselves bogged down on ground that had looked perfectly solid. The Germans adapted, of course. They brought up engineers to probe the ground ahead of advancing tanks. They started sticking to paved roads and known firm paths. But this was exactly what the Allied defenders wanted. Tanks confined to roads could be ambushed. Tanks moving slowly could be engaged at range. The Germans' greatest advantage, their mobility and speed, had been neutralized. The Battle of Arras on May 21st showed the full potential of Heinrich's innovation. British and French forces, using terrain modified by local farmers following Heinrich's techniques, stopped a German armored thrust that should have broken through to the coast. The Germans lost 37 tanks in that engagement, most of them immobilized by the terrain rather than destroyed by direct fire. The counterattack failed, but the delay it caused gave the Allies precious time to organize the evacuation at Dunkirk. Military analysts estimate that the agricultural modifications delayed the German advance in northern France by 4 to 6 days. In the context of May 1940, when hours mattered and every day allowed more Allied troops to escape encirclement, 4 to 6 days was enormous. Conservative estimates suggest that between 15,000 and 30,000 additional Allied soldiers escaped capture or death because the German advance slowed just enough to open escape routes. General Alan Brooke, commanding 2nd Corps of the British Expeditionary Force, mentioned the terrain difficulties in his diary entry of May 22nd. The going has been unexpectedly difficult for German armor. Intelligence suggests the French farmers have been sabotaging field drainage. Bloody brilliant if true. Even the Germans recognized the effectiveness. A captured German tank commander, interrogated after being found on foot 3 miles from his immobilized Panzer III, described his frustration. The maps showed good terrain. The ground looked solid. We advanced and simply sank. There was no warning, no visible trap. We felt like idiots, disabled not by the enemy, but by French mud. The technique spread throughout the Allied defensive positions in France, and later influenced defensive preparations in Britain during the invasion scare of 1940 to 1941. British farmers, following guidelines derived from Heinrich's work, modified thousands of acres of farmland in southern England, creating what became known as agricultural defense in depth. The innovation changed tactical doctrine in subtle but important ways. For the first time, military planners had to seriously consider that farmland might be weaponized using agricultural knowledge. Intelligence officers began recruiting farmers as consultants. Engineers studied soil mechanics with new urgency. Tank designers started considering how to detect subsurface water saturation. Heinrich himself never received official recognition during the war. The Belgian captain who'd authorized his first experiment died in combat in June 1940. Records were lost in the chaos of the French surrender. Heinrich spent the war years under German occupation, working his farm, keeping his head down, never mentioning what he'd done. But other farmers knew. The story spread quietly through the agricultural communities of northern France. The old men in the cafes would sometimes mention Vanderkamp's trick when discussing the war, though they never elaborated to outsiders. It was farmers' knowledge, passed between people who understood soil and water and the land. In 1957, a Belgian military historian researching the battles of May 1940 interviewed veterans and stumbled across references to modified farmland and trapped tanks. He tracked down Heinrich Vanderkamp, now 70 years old, still farming the same land, still living in the same house. The interview was brief. Heinrich was not a man given to self-promotion. Did you really develop the agricultural anti-tank technique? I understood dirt. That's all. I knew what wet dirt does to heavy things. Do you realize how many lives you may have saved? Heinrich shrugged. I was just a farmer trying to protect his land. Lots of people did brave things in the war. I just did what made sense to me. But your innovation was used across... I wasn't special, Heinrich interrupted. I was just a guy who paid attention to his fields. The problem was right there in front of everyone. The generals just couldn't see it because they were thinking about guns and armor. Sometimes you need someone who thinks about soil. The historian pressed him about the broader implications, about whether military institutions should have systems to capture unconventional ideas from civilians. Heinrich considered this for a moment. The captain who listened to me, he was exhausted, desperate, willing to try anything. Maybe that's what it takes. Not better systems, but worse situations where people finally listen to ideas they'd normally dismiss. I don't know if that's a good lesson or a sad one. Heinrich Vanderkamp died in 1963, at age 76, of a heart attack while working in his fields during harvest season. His obituary in the local paper made no mention of the war, listing him simply as a farmer who'd served his community for decades. His children sold the farm and moved to the city. The land was eventually consolidated into a larger agricultural operation, and the old farmhouse was torn down. But in the Bastogne War Museum, In a small section dedicated to unconventional warfare tactics, there's a display about agricultural defense techniques used in 1940. A diagram shows how drainage systems can be modified to create anti-tank traps. A photograph, grainy and yellowed, shows a German Panzer II stuck in a field, its crew standing beside it, looking bewildered. The placard reads, "Innovation often comes from unexpected sources. The agricultural modifications that delayed the German advance in May 1940 were developed by farmers using centuries of knowledge about land management, adapted for military purposes by necessity." Heinrich's name isn't mentioned. He wouldn't have wanted it to be. A German general, captured late in the war and interviewed extensively about tactical failures, was asked about the Northern France campaign. He mentioned many things: Allied resistance, supply difficulties, weather. Then, almost as an afterthought, and the ground. The ground betrayed us sometimes. It looked solid but wasn't. We learned to distrust what we couldn't verify. It cost us speed, and speed was everything. Someone had taught the Wehrmacht to distrust perfect farmland. Someone had exposed a vulnerability that no armor could defend against. Someone had proven that warfare isn't just about firepower and maneuver, but about understanding terrain in ways the military textbooks never considered. Hitler's biggest secret wasn't his wonder weapons or his battle plans or his early advantages in armor and aircraft. It was simpler than that. His biggest secret was that his Blitzkrieg relied entirely on good going, on firm ground and clear routes and predictable terrain. And one potato farmer in northern France exposed that secret by doing what farmers had always done. By working with the land, understanding the land, and making the land do what he needed it to do. Even if nobody remembered his name,